I work nights at a hospital on the janitorial staff. It's a pretty easy job, but the place really gives me the creeps. I've been working here for a little over a month, and the reason it makes me feel uneasy is the freaking ghost stories. I hear the nurses and doctors talk about them all the time. Random doors slamming in the hallways, shadow figures, and another set of footsteps following behind you on the stairwells. All these rumours really make me feel uneasy when I'm mopping up a dimly lit floor of the hospital. The money is good, and it's the only thing keeping me going, but something happened the other night that makes me want to quit. It all started a week ago when I prepared for my shift. Everyone in the West Wing was talking about a patient, a teenage girl, recovering from a terrible accident. According to reports, there was an electrical fire in the poor girl's room, and she barely escaped alive. Unfortunately, the girl was left with severe burns all over her body and was recovering in a room all wrapped up after an emergency treatment. My heart ached for the patient. I'm not hardened like these nurses and doctors, so hearing things like that really gets to me. The girl's the same age as my little sister, and I couldn't help but feel sad about what happened to her. I moved out of our parents' place a year ago, and in the process of living my own life, I haven't made much time to go back and visit. I shook the thoughts out of my head. I had to leave the personal stuff at the door and try to be professional. I winced when I was assigned to the West Wing that night, but I got my mop ready and was ready to go. The work was routine, with nothing out of the ordinary. I cleaned the restrooms, wiped down the counters, and organised the nurse stations. I yawned, checking the time to see that it was nearly 2 a.m. I had some extra time and knew I was breaking the rules, but I was so curious I got into the elevator and went to see the girl. I made my way up as I towed my janitorial cart, and I got to the girl's floor. The hallways were dimmed with only a few fluorescent lights on. Everything was so quiet, and my cart's squeaks echoed as I stepped forward. I looked towards the nurse's station to see a woman typing away at one of the computers. I slowly walked around. All the patients' doors were closed, except for one. I made my way over to see someone lying on a bed. All these wires connected to different machines were hooked to a thin frame covered head to toe in white bandages. I just stood there for a moment and just stared, hoping that this girl would recover. "Excuse me, can I help you?" the woman at the nurse's station called out to me. I turned and apologized, but the woman stopped me. "What a horrible thing, huh?" she spoke, and I walked towards her, propping myself up on the counter. "The girl was home alone when it happened. Her parents are out of town, but they'll be here in the morning." I let out a sigh. Jesus. The woman must have sensed how I felt and asked me if I was okay. But before I could answer, I got a call from my walkie-talkie. "Duty calls," I muttered, and pushed my cart back towards the elevator. I went down to help sanitize some of the patients' rooms, which didn't take very long. This floor was almost completely empty, so that made things much easier. As I was wrapping up one of the rooms, I stepped out towards my cart that was in the hallway. It was so damn quiet, until I heard the elevator doors open. I glanced over, and you can imagine my shock when I saw that thin, bandaged girl standing all alone in the elevator. We were only a few feet apart. I stood there looking in awe as she stared at me. I could hear her raspy breathing, and the light above us began to flicker. "Hey, you shouldn't be walking around like this," I said, trying to sound authoritative. But something about this situation was making me feel uneasy. It's just a hurt little girl, I told myself. Here, let's get you back up to your room, okay? I told her. I stepped in the elevator. The door shut behind me and I pressed the button to her floor. We both stood motionless, the elevator groaning as it moved upward. A smell struck me, causing me to fight back the urge to vomit. The space around us was filled with the smell of burnt meat. I looked towards the girl. I hadn't noticed until she was there facing me. She stood in an awkward stance. Her legs were bent, and her head was askew. There weren't any bandages over her mouth and eyes, so I could see her damaged lips open as she continued her raspy breathing. I could see her eyes. The irises and pupils were completely white. I opened my mouth to speak, but the taste of smoke assaulted me. I began to cough uncontrollably as my throat was filled with unseen fumes. Sweat began to pour out of me. The elevator felt so hot. The girl began to move towards me. I could hear a sizzle with each of her steps. She opened her mouth and began to scream. "Help! Help me!" She grabbed my arms and I felt a burning sensation from her touch. I tried to shake myself from her grip, but she overpowered me. "Help me!" she screamed again. And behind her, I saw flames. The whole elevator was being consumed by a hellish inferno. Her bandages were touched by a cinder and began to catch fire. She was burning in front of me, the white bandages quickly catching flame and disintegrating before my eyes. Underneath her wraps was melted flesh, and her mouth was open to let out an agonized wail. The flames went down her neck, down her arms, and ran up towards me. I watched helplessly as the fire started to eat me alive. I screamed with all of my might until the noise caught me off guard. I looked around to see that the elevator was completely empty. The doors opened and I was on the girl's floor. In the hallway were some nurses and someone walking around towards me with a gurney. The person was covered, but I knew who it was. The woman from earlier on was standing there, and I walked over to her. She explained to me that the girl had just passed away. I was drenched in sweat and I touched both my arms. I could still feel the searing burn. The woman looked at me and grabbed my hand, asking me if I was okay. I didn't know how to respond. I had just experienced something so intense, so unreal. I stared back at the elevator and the doors had already shut. I told the woman that I must have been tired or something, but she gripped my hand tighter. She assured me that these things happen sometimes at this hospital, that it's just another ghost story for the place. As I walked through the old apartment building, I let out a frustrated sigh. My brother-in-law owns the place, and he's proud to brag about how much money he's made since raising the rent here. The guy's a jerk, and yet I'm working maintenance for him. I'm not even a maintenance man. I just look up how to fix things on YouTube. He pays me well enough for me to be content, and I'm cheap enough for him to save some money. Today's job seems plenty easy enough. A little old lady at 3B needs to get her bathtub fixed. In my mind, it sounded like a clog or something. but she complained to my brother-in-law that it was something much worse. He really threw a tantrum about it, but if it was just a clog, fine, easy cash for me. I got to 3B and knocked on the door. After a minute or so, the door creaked open and in front of me was an older woman. She was hunched over with long white hair and wearing a dark purple dress. Her nose was long and hooked at the tip, and she gave me a smile with a few missing teeth. I held back laughter as I imagined her flying around on a broomstick. I straightened up and introduced myself, to which she grabbed my hand to greet me. Her hands were soft and warm. For a second, I remembered my grandmother. She pulled me inside of her home and led me to the bathroom. I took quick glances around the place as I followed her. The place was filthy with piles of full trash bags lining the walls. The air had a rotting odour within it that got stronger as I continued to walk with the lady. We reached a door, and as she opened it, I was hit with a putrid stench. The old lady seemed unfazed, but I was gagging. She turned to look at me, asking me if I was okay. I coughed a bit more, and after a minute, I managed to compose myself. I assured her I'll get things fixed, and I walked into the room. The bathroom was small. Just like the rest of the apartment, it hadn't been cleaned in ages. I looked at the bathtub, and the bottom was filled with about 6 inches of jet black water. I set my tool bag onto the floor and rummaged inside to find my drain auger. I set the tip of the long coil into the dark water where I thought the drain would be. There was no resistance, but the coil sank deeper and deeper. I began to slowly crank the auger and the coil twisted, but the water was still motionless. Confused, I tried to retract the drain auger, but it wasn't coming up. I stood up and pulled, but there was no give. I let out another sigh as I rolled up my left sleeve. I got onto my knees beside the tub. The smell was absolutely horrendous. I cleared my mind and plunged my left arm into the dark water. My hand went through. The water felt like sludge, as if I was putting my hand through ink, and it was ice cold. I pushed down and noticed that I had submerged most of my forearm inside the water. There was no way this tub was that deep. What the fu... Before I finished my words, I felt something grab my hand and yank me. My right hand grabbed the edge of the tub, and I managed to stop myself before I was pulled inside the water. Whatever had a hold of my left hand was not letting go, and it continued its attempts to pull me in. I resisted, the black water splashing up everywhere, causing beads of darkness to cover the bathroom. I pulled my arm, and then I heard a pop. I let out a scream as a sharp pain exploded from my left shoulder. The old lady called out, asking me if I was okay, but I continued to cry in pain. Whatever was inside this pitch-black water was going to take my arm off. I managed to prop a leg on the edge of the bathtub and pushed with it, giving me enough strength to slowly pull my arm up. I clutched at my slumped left arm with my right and pulled. A wave of relief hit me when I saw my hand, but it turned to pure terror when I saw a thin, bony hand grasping mine. The other hand, still grasping mine, came up, and emerging from the water was an arm, shoulder, then face of an old man. His face was bloated. He stared at me with empty grey eyes, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. I called out for help, and when I turned around to look out the door, I saw the old lady staring towards us in fear.
"Robert, my Robert,"
she muttered under her breath. The man's gaze shifted towards the lady, and he let go of my hand to reach towards her. I stumbled backwards and slammed into the bathroom sink. The lady shuffled towards the bathtub, and she called out to him.
"I'm so sorry, Robert. I couldn't hear you call out to me. I couldn't hear you drain."
She slowly stretched out both of her arms, and the old man grabbed them. Before I knew it, she was pulled so violently, she made a loud thud as her legs hit the edge of the tub. She didn't have a chance to scream, as she was quickly submerged inside the black water. The water bubbled, and then silence. Slowly the water sank through the drain, and eventually all the pitch-black water disappeared. Working in a pawn shop, we get all kinds of weird stuff. But there's one thing they all have in common. Their condition. Dresses are stained, handbags are ripped, even jewellery is wonky and bent. That's what made the Matryoshka doll so special. She was in perfect condition. I found her while sorting through Wednesday's sales. As soon as I saw her, I gasped. Almond-coloured wood, finely carved into a peanut shape. A beautiful face, painted more photorealistically than any other Matryoshka doll I'd seen. Sparkling blue eyes and rosy cheeks, with a colourful scarf tying up her black hair. I set her on the table with the other goods destined for the back of the shop. But then, my curiosity got the better of me. I picked her back up and twisted her open. An identical doll stared back up at me, just a little bit smaller. Rosy cheeks, pretty blue eyes, pink and white flowers painted on her dress. I took her out of the bottom shell, and inside, another doll stared back up at me, except this one wasn't identical. It was nearly identical, but the woman's mouth was open this time, in a little O. Her hands were unclasped as well, and hanging at her sides. I thought they were all supposed to look the same. I'd seen some Matryoshka dolls that had made changes to the woman's dress, different flowers or patterns with each iteration, but the woman's face usually appeared identical. I twist her open again. The woman's mouth was open wider. Her eyes were wider too, the black strokes of her eyelids bulging out from the previous almond shape. Her elbows were bent, and her hands were moving up towards her face. I paused, glancing from this doll to the other three. I froze. The fifth doll's mouth was wide open, as if she was screaming. Her eyes were so wide they were nearly perfect circles, and her hands were held out in front of her body, as if she were trying to defend herself. I sat there for a long time, staring at that painted face. This was starting to feel like some sort of joke. Someone trying to scare me. Come to think of it, the Matryoshka doll didn't look that different from me. Black hair, blue eyes. Is this supposed to be some sort of threat? I shook my head. Sighing, I twisted the doll open again, and it clattered to the floor. The woman's face was covered in blood, dark red painted in meticulous lines down the side of her face. It dripped off of her face and onto her dress, staining the pink flowers red. When I picked it up, I felt a deep scratch in the wood, on the back of her head. I felt sick. I set the doll down on the table and took a deep breath. I'll get here early, finish inventory in the morning. It was almost 10 o'clock, and there was no way I was going to stay here another second with this creepy doll. But as I began to stand, my curiosity again got the better of me. I snatched the doll off the table and pulled her apart again. My blood ran cold. The doll looked similar to the previous one, blood dripping down her face and onto her dress, mouth hanging open in a silent scream, except in this one, her eyes were closed, and her skin was so pale, it was almost blue. My heart pounded in my ears, hands shaking. I pulled at the ends of the doll. My hands slipped against the wood, but on the third try, I finally got the doll open. But there wasn't a doll inside. Instead, there was a folded piece of paper. I was shaking like a leaf, but I pulled the paper out of the doll and unfolded it, little black dots dancing at the edge of my vision. 4 little words written in sloppy scrawl. I'll see you soon. I ran out of the pawn shop. I thought I heard the distinctive thump of footsteps behind me, but I dove into my car without looking back. When I got to my apartment, I drew the deadbolt and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. The police haven't been able to find who did this. My boss remembers the man who sold it to us, but his description matches nearly every white, brown-haired guy in America. The name he used was fake, and we don't have security cameras. He's untraceable. I quit my job and moved to a new apartment, but other than that, I don't know what to do. Part of me thinks that, since nothing has happened in months, he's moved on. But then I have the nightmares. Nightmares of being crammed into a life-size Matryoshka doll. The wood closing in like a coffin. The sliver of light at my waist getting narrower by the second. Then, the wooden ends meet, and I'm scratching at the wood, screaming for help. My mouth open like an O, like the painted face of the doll. But nobody can hear me.